Hi, my name is Mattia Murray, and welcome to The Longer Road. You are on the longer road if you have multiple intersectional identities that are often marginalized. You've had to work harder to get to the starting line, and you might feel behind. I'm here to provide hope, support, and practical tips, and to let you know that you're not alone. Welcome. Today, we are talking about the stories we tell ourselves. And if my voice sounds a tiny bit different today, it's because I'm wearing my mouth guard because I got ready for bed and then I had this idea and I really wanted to capture it spontaneously because it's kind of these ideas about stories that have been fomenting in my mind. And then today I went and saw the Jordan Peele movie Nope, which, if you're not into horror at all, I've gotten more into the horror genre since I started scoring horror films. It was fun. I enjoyed it. It was not super horror-y. It was actually more sci-fi, but then also kind of a Western. My overall thought today is how much of our experience is shaped by the stories we tell about what's happening. You probably have a large set of opinions about this idea because you've probably heard it in different forms. So, for example, if you've personally had cognitive behavioral therapy ideas weaponized against you, you might be, for example, very resistant to the idea that our stories significantly shape our perception of reality. If you are an evolutionary scientist and you have a really good grasp on what a tiny sliver of reality we're really perceiving from an evolutionary perspective, again, you're going to have a very different frame on what I'm talking about. I am talking about a particular slice of this conversation right now, which is basically about myth, M-Y-T-H. This is also on my mind because I'm reading my friend's beautiful book that just came out, Tales from When I Had a Face, by James Curcio. It's an illustrated novel, which means it's not a graphic novel. It's not images on every page, but it's text, and then there will be some beautiful images interspersed throughout. And James and I and a couple of other people also have a joint EP coming out soon. And Tales from When I Had a Face is a very mythologically rooted story or set of stories. I'm not sure how they would classify that exactly, but there's definitely a strong mythological underpinning. So when I say myth, I mean almost the ideas underneath beliefs, or maybe beliefs, depending on how you identify them. So, for example, the economy, the country that we live in, the idea of money, there are these sort of broad categorical underpinnings that we rarely question. And when we do, it's still usually within the general framework of agreeing that the thing we're talking about is real. So, for example, if you've done money mindset work, that's not really questioning whether money exists or what it is. It's just trying to have more useful beliefs about it within the system in which money exists in the way that it does, if that makes sense. So we have these large mythological structures underpinning what I then think of as a layer of beliefs on top of that. And the reason I'm making a distinction between the two, and again, you may not, is I think beliefs are knowable because they're sentences. So you can find a belief, you've probably done this in pretty much any form, almost any form of therapeutic type work. At some point, you're going to notice, oh, I believe this thing, and I believe it so implicitly that I've never really said the sentence out loud in a way where another part of me could view it and go, ugh, I don't know if I want to believe that. So to me, that's a belief. And this thought that I'm trying to get to is that I think the reason myths are so powerful is because they're not a sentence, they're not a single belief, they're a story. And stories sit with us in a very different way. Another little piece that kind of led me to this thought tonight is that this last week I was hanging out with a friend who makes other works based on children's books. I believe it's curriculum. pieces. I'm not sure exactly what, but basically she reads a lot of children's books and then she writes these lessons based on them, which is really cool. And we were talking about something and she remembered a really specific historical fact because she'd read it in a children's book. And when you learn something from a story, it's easier to remember, which is funny because I have that stereotypical autistic thing of not so much telling stories as just listing a bunch of facts instead of actually ordering them in a sort of beginning, middle, end kind of structure. As I did just there. I didn't tell you a story about that friend. I just listed some facts about the encounter, which is fine. And to use what I just said as an example, it's a belief that I have that I'm not great at storytelling. So that's like a sentence I can see. And then maybe some mythological structures underpinning that are how we conceptualize how conversations are supposed to work or how stories are supposed to work. So they're not necessarily objective truth. They're still culturally informed. But one reason I think it can be really useful to think about how impactful stories are is to look at how they've affected our last couple of elections in the US, if you're in the US. And I'm sorry, because I know not all of my listeners are, but you probably heard about it. We had kind of a shit show here. And there are a lot of ways to look at it, and I have enough conservative family members that I feel like I have an interesting perspective on what happened growing up really conservative and kind of seeing different ways that that played out in different conservative mindsets. But it wasn't about conservative versus liberal. It wasn't about the working class finally being fed up. It really was about these myths and these stories that people tie into so strongly that they don't even realize they're doing it. One of those was American exceptionalism, the idea that America is the best country and should remain so. That was obviously a huge underpinning of that campaign, but it's not new. It's a story that already existed, a myth that already existed, and some very nasty people were able to get their hooks in it and use it very effectively. One reason I'm glad that I found out I was autistic is that I had such a strong aversion to manipulating people in any way that I was actually, for a while, communicating even worse than probably my natural state, because I had noticed some patterns that I was like, that's manipulation and I don't want to do it. It was actually really useful for me to learn, oh, okay, I have a pattern recognition brain. I'm probably picking up on some things that are honestly too subtle to worry about. And then 2, I have this already kind of natural difficulty communicating in some specific ways. And if there are other things I can do to help balance that out, that's actually a good thing. It's not manipulating. It's actually me trying to connect. But one of the things that I really was reacting to was actually how I saw people using story. And I remember at one point some years ago thinking, I don't want to tell stories anymore, like at all. Because I noticed that they made people listen more, they made people remember more, and that felt manipulative to me. I was like, I don't want to make people listen to me more than they want to just because I'm telling a good story. Maybe this sounds hilarious to you from the outside, but this is what was happening in my brain at the time. I think I still have a little bit of that, which again is kind of funny because if you've just been listening to me for the past 8 minutes or however long this ends up being into the episode, you've chosen to listen to my voice. And there's something about it that speaks to you and is providing something to you or you're enjoying in some way, right? That's why you're here. It's giving you something. And I really appreciate that. I love that even from a distance, we can have this back and forth. But I think my actual deep fear under not wanting to manipulate people was actually recognizing that stories can deeply change people. And that can have beautiful effects, and it can be the underpinning for cults and dictatorships and, I don't know, mean chefs in a kitchen. Sorry, I just saw an ad for a weird horror movie about a chef played by Ralph Fiennes, apropos of nothing. So, assuming that I'm onto something here, why does it matter? I have two things in mind right now, and I actually would be very curious to hear from you at the end of this episode if you think of any other kind of interesting related ideas or think of other kind of conclusions that I'm not drawing. I have two things in mind. One, personally for me, realizing that other people are caught up in a bad story, in a story that has the potential to cause harm, makes me view that person very differently than if I just think they're evil and bad and doing shitty things. That does not absolve anyone of any actual bad things they do, right? But even if it's on the small side of that, just someone kind of not doing what I wish they would be doing. They're not doing it to spite me, right? They are doing what makes sense to them based on the information they have and how they're feeling and the best they know how to do. Again, doesn't justify any negative behavior. But I feel very differently toward, say, some of my extended family who I'm not really in contact with, who are very, very conservative, knowing that they're caught up in this really tightly woven web of lies that were honestly constructed over a period of decades by people who had an agenda and they made that agenda happen. Ha ha about the gay agenda, because, here we are with a stacked Supreme Court, the actual agenda of the evangelical right for many, many years. That was driven by stories about white supremacy, about white people becoming a minority and Christians being persecuted, whatever. So many different stories that went into it. Again, doesn't justify any negative behavior or any of the harm done. But on the individual level, the individual people, and specifically some people I know who are deeply uneducated, not just in terms of schooling, but never learned any critical thinking skills at all, and are overworked, underpaid, very poor, and just struggling to keep their family alive. They don't have the actual capacity to just kind of sit back and think and question these stories in a deep way. So I've experienced some forms of privilege that some other members of my extended family have never experienced and probably never will because of their life circumstances. I was able to take time and question, and I went to a liberal arts college and I got to be exposed to a lot of different ideas and different stories. And I think I mentioned a couple episodes ago that to me, truth feels good and has this nice, pingy, little bell-like quality in my body. When I started hearing these new stories, when I was exposed to them, mostly in college, sometimes they really clashed in a way that felt uncomfortable, but sometimes I just felt like, oh, wow, that feels correct. That feels right. And I think that stories can do that in a way. So for a lot of people, that's hearing, and this is the second way that I think this is really useful, stories humanize and they present information. They kind of slip information in through emotion in a way that really lands. We know this from watching movies, from hearing songs, right? You can kind of receive new ideas and information in a less threatening way. And actually, comedy is another major area that people talk about. You can get stuff in there through comedy. Once people are laughing, they're feeling good, they're in a good nervous system state, and you can kind of present things to them when they're in this state. Again, that can be used in a negative, manipulative way. I mean, I think it's manipulative either way. It's also a deep part of human culture that we're all used to doing. This is also one of the reasons that people coming out in a variety of ways can be so meaningful. And it's interesting that I feel like this is happening again with me. So I came out as queer, and then I came out as binary, well, genderqueer, and then non-binary, trans, kind of that kept evolving. It's like my gender's still evolving, but whatever. And now with coming out as autistic, it's so interesting because to me, it just feels like an obvious fact. I feel like if you know me, it's not surprising. And then, I still get people who are like, oh, you don't seem autistic, which don't say that. Don't say that to anyone. It's not cool. But I'm presenting to some people a face of autism that they've never seen because they've only experienced a very specific stereotypical view of it. So as I'm out here being fairly open, talking about myself, part of what that's doing is helping embed information for people through this sort of general storytelling frame, even if I'm not telling a literal story. Now, even if they didn't know a trans person before or a non-binary person or, well, who's out, or if they didn't know someone who was autistic and all of these different elements of who I am, now, when they're exposed to new information, maybe in the back of their mind, they're thinking about me. If I'm their first or second or third exposure, right? Kind of early on in this system their brain is forming of how to define people. So to me, it's very important for me to put my own experiences out there with the caveat that they're only my experiences and I'm absolutely not speaking for anyone else. Because one of the things I'm putting out there is, this is not bad. This is a neurotype. This is who I am. I like it. I like my brain. I don't want to be cured. I think my brain is awesome and I love it. There are some things that are made difficult by society. Same about being trans. And even just that our conception of trans is shaped societally. If you find this interesting, and if you want to kind of follow the rabbit hole about how deep stories go, they also go to what is reality. I think pretty much everybody who works with physics or the brain would agree that there's not an objective reality. We're all perceiving very different things. And we used to think, okay, we're all kind of perceiving different versions of the same reality. But now the more we're digging into physics, we're realizing, okay, if there is an objective reality, humans may be unable to perceive it. Okay, that's fine. I think that's actually really exciting in opening up the power of storytelling and the power of myth. Because we are agreeing as people on some of these fundamental things that underpin the sentences that are our beliefs, which underpin the actions that we take. And if we're taking a step back and kind of questioning everything, which I do all the time, it's a lot easier to question, should you be able to own land? I personally don't think so. I think land ownership is generally not a great thing. That causes a lot of harm. You can step back and question all the major structures and ideas. No, I don't think that immediately leads to throwing everything out the window. But I think there are a lot of opportunities to tell better stories, to frame and reframe our own personal stories, and tell them in ways that feel good to us. I think at their best, stories can be healing and they can change lives. And I think we know that we need to write some better ones if we're going to build a sustainable world and deal with climate change and income inequality and these major issues. Certainly if humanity wants to survive, which we're not really acting like we do, but I'm willing to help. Thanks for hanging in with me on a bit more of an abstract episode. Again, if you have any thoughts on this one, I would be very curious to hear them. And now that we're almost 35 episodes in, if you've been listening, I think you have a sense that some of my main topics are equality, brains, wellness, mental health, trauma, variety of healing modalities. And I would say my main gist or theme or goal is helping people with multiple challenges or multiple marginalized identities to be able to live an amazing life. that is pretty broad. So if you have any suggestions for topics or books you're wondering if I read or think I should read, or guests that you'd be interested in me having, I know I have a loyal listener base. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the messages you're sending me. And if you have any suggestions, questions, topics, etc., please send them my way, because I would love to be creating content around your interests. And that includes if I have an episode where you want me to dig in more, or there was one point that you really wanted me to elaborate on and I didn't, anything you're interested in, let me know. I want to direct that content to you specifically. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening. If you know someone who would be helped by this podcast, please share it with them. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions at mattia@mattiamurray.com. That's MATTIA at MATTIAMAUREE.com. Thank you.